Hello everyone and welcome back to another video. This time I'll be painting this awesome Blood Angel Space Marine with something similar to the box art recipe. Those of you familiar with my Ultramarine tutorial will know that I love the box art style, and indeed I used to work on the Eavy Metal team itself, and these are just a small selection of the miniatures that I painted during my time there. I did this for almost a decade, and many of these paint jobs you will have no doubt seen on the covers of boxes and on the website. Now in this tutorial I'll be using very similar recipes to the box art Blood Angels, however there's a bit more glazing and blending involved to achieve this end result. Although you might not want to paint an entire army to this standard, and understandably because it takes a bit of time, perhaps there's something still here for those of you who wish to push your painting to display standard, or even just for characters in your army. Where possible in this tutorial, I'll mention areas where you can simplify the recipe and still get a great looking end result in less time. So without further ado, let's get into the video. Here is a list of the paints I'll be using in this tutorial. So to start off with here, I'm going to be base coating the whole miniature with a 50-50 mix of Evil Sun Scarlet and Mephiston Red. And for the sake of time here, I'm just using an airbrush to get a nice even coat across the miniature. You can also just use a regular brush, but it'll take a bit more patience. Once that was dry, I quickly went round and blacked out all the surrounding details of the armour that would later be painted either black or metal. Particularly with the undersuit, it's good to do this at this stage as it's much easier to tidy any mistakes. Oh, and for anyone wondering, because I get asked this question quite a lot, the individual parts are held onto the corks using paper clips, and these are placed into pre-drilled holes made with a hobby drill, and it's just an inexpensive and easy way of mounting individual parts for painting like this. Now onto the shading stage, and I'm going to be using thin glazes of corn red for this. I decided for this armour that I wanted a nice deep rich red with some smooth transitions towards the lower parts of the panels. I really love the Citadel reds for this, and they're probably some of my favourite paints from the entire range. They're just so smooth and nice to work with. Something to bear in mind when glazing is that the majority of the pigment will be left at the point of the brush, so you can use this to control where you want the shade to be by drawing the brush towards a shaded area. It can take a few layers of glazing to build up the desired effect, and it does take a bit of patience, but it's also a very reliable method of creating transitions on the model, and because the paint is very thin, it doesn't leave any unwanted texture on the surface. If you are painting this for an army, then you can go ahead and skip this stage entirely, and instead simply apply the next stage as a line shade between the panels in a similar way to my Ultramarine tutorial. Continuing on with the shading here, I added some Incubi Darkness into the corn red, and I'm going to be using this in a much more controlled way this time to darken down between the panels of the armour. Make sure to thin this enough so that it flows nicely into the recesses, but not so thin that it becomes a wash, as we're looking to create a more opaque line shade. The Incubi is a really nice dark greeny blue that when added into the corn creates a deep burgundy, which will work well for the rich red that we're going for. This is also a recipe that works really well for rich red cloth and robes on your miniatures. Now I wanted to make the shading a bit more noticeable towards the lower parts of the legs, so I thinned down this mix a bit further and glazed it towards the bottom of the panels. When creating transitions on armour and other parts of the miniature, I much prefer to use a paint rather than just covering an area with a wash. With paint it's much easier to build up an opaque and smooth transition over larger surfaces, and in fact this is the way that Eavy Metal prefer to work nowadays. A possible exception to this would maybe be a finishing touch like on red armour, where at the end you can bring together all the reds with thin glazes of a red contrast paint or shade paint. But in such instances it's used very thinned down and controlled as a glaze. Sometimes with red I also find that it can help to glaze a very thinned down matte medium over the surface to unify the finish at the end. Personally my absolute favourite is a mix of Daler Rowney glaze medium and a tiny bit of AK Ultra Matte. This gives me a really nice consistent finish without dulling down the colour of the miniature. Now I went on to increase the shading in the deeper recesses by adding some black into the previous mix. This is going to help to give it a nice strong definition between the panels and also help to make the highlight stages pop. Now with all of the shading stages out of the way, I smoothed out the transitions on the larger panels by glazing back with the base coat, this time pushing the glaze towards the upper parts of the panels. Now we have a nice smooth foundation to start to add some highlights to, and for this first highlight stage I'll use Evil Sunz Scarlet. I'm just applying this at the usual chunky edge highlight width around all of the edges of the armour. It's important for this stage to be chunky enough so that it's still slightly visible behind the later stages. This way we create nice smooth graduated highlights around the edges of the miniature. You might also notice here that I'm blending out this first stage highlight towards the top of the panels and then just keeping it as a regular chunky edge highlight around the shaded areas. This is because I'm going for a more blended end result. However, again, if you're painting this for an army, feel free to skip this glazing stage and just keep it as a regular line highlight. Now at this point I'd like to take a moment just to say a massive thank you to everyone here on YouTube. I've recently hit just over 17,000 subscribers after taking a break to focus on Golden Demons, streaming, tuition, and also building up a collection of in-depth tutorials over on my Patreon. So if you feel like supporting the channel and also having a say in the future content and access to a whole host of videos like this, then feel free to check that out. I'm hopefully going to be back to making more content like this on YouTube on a more regular basis, and perhaps some shorter content on specific topics and techniques. So if that's something that you'd be interested in seeing, hit that subscribe button. Now onto the second stage highlight here, and for this I'm going to be using Wild Rider Red. I'm not sure my palette camera is entirely accurate here as it looks more like Troll Slayer Orange, however I assure you it is in fact Wild Rider Red. Now if any of you are familiar with Troll Slayer Orange, I probably don't need to tell you that it has absolutely awful coverage, so if you're looking for a good alternative I recommend AK Deep Orange. It's very close in hue and is so much nicer to work with. With this highlight stage obviously we're going to be much more controlled and placing it within the previous stage. Something that people tend to struggle a little bit with painting in this style is the extreme precision and brush control required for the finer highlight stages, and I have a few tips on this subject which might be useful. I get many questions about specific brushes I use, but I assure you there is no one magic brush that will just make your highlights sharper, and brushes that I find work for me might not work for you. Generally speaking though, you might have an easier time using good quality Kolinsky Sable brushes. And personally, I enjoy using the more triangular pointed miniature series brush from Winsor & Newton. However, I will often just use whatever brush is close at hand at the time. More important than the specific brush selection is the fine management of both paint consistency and the amount of paint on the brush. You might notice that I mostly only ever have paint on the tip of the brush, and I'll often adjust the amount of paint on the side of my hand. Bracing position of your hand is also very important. I tend to brace my painting hand on top of the hand holding the miniature, and you can use cheap magnifiers if your eyesight is beginning to struggle like mine. Good strong lighting is also very important to be able to clearly see where the point of the brush is, and to try to gently apply the tip to the edge of the miniature. Other than that, it's really just down to practice, and your brush control will naturally improve the more that you paint. Moving on to the next highlight stage now, and I'm going to be using Fire Dragon Bright for this. On the subject of highlights, I tend to mostly only take the first few stages around all of the edges of the armour, focusing the later stages towards the top edges. But this can vary depending on the look that I'm going for. You can choose to focus the later stages on the upper and most prominent edges if you want to, or you can place your highlights uniformly around the whole miniature. This is completely up to you, and there's no right or wrong way to go about this. I often hear that Eavy Metal simply highlight around everything equally, and broadly speaking this isn't true. Now I know that overall the house style of the Eavy Metal team has a very coherent look and can appear as if it's all done by one painter, and that's almost the goal to a certain extent. However, if you look closely you'll see that there is a lot of variation in how things are approached, and highlight placement is one of those. Certainly when I worked in the team there was never really any strict guidelines about exactly how far highlights should be placed, or anything like that which would limit creative freedom. And I know this style isn't for everyone, but there is absolutely no shame in just copying the box art style, and I personally love that really defined look, but obviously feel free to experiment and find out what is most visually pleasing to you. Now as far as the Eavy Metal style goes, as long as all of the sculptural elements of the miniature are nicely defined and readable, there is actually quite a broad range of techniques and nuances that will fit within it. I think slight changes in the studio style over the past few years are particularly noticeable in the way that Eavy Metal will render textures quite differently. For example, cloth, skin and other organic shapes will tend to be highlighted much more softly than armour. On the same subject, I've recently really enjoyed seeing the new Seraphon miniatures, and I think this is a good example of how you can see the differences both sculpturally and how they've been rendered by the studio, and it's quite different from the old range now. And I think a lot of this just comes down to timing really. Obviously it's much quicker just to stick an edge highlight around everything, and as soon as you start to blend or glaze it does increase the time quite significantly. But it's awesome to see that the house style is developing a bit more now, and more time is obviously being allowed for the paint jobs. Moving on to the final highlight stage now, and I'll be using Ungor Flesh for this. You could also use something like Towerlight Ochre and White, and I'm just focusing this on the sharpest edges where light would be hitting. This stage helps to desaturate the orange in the previous stages and can help to draw focus to certain areas of the miniature. It also helps to give the armour that nice crisp and defined look, but it's important to keep this stage sharp and within the previous stages. Now, as I'm going here, I'm starting to add some white reflection dots on the corners of the armour. You don't need to go too overboard with this, but it's just a nice finishing touch. I like to add them to any particularly sharp upwards facing corners. Now I continued on with the highlight stages for the other parts of the armour. You can see this backpack has some quite sharp corners, so it's easy for me to focus these later stages here and get a nice sharp look. On some areas, like on the beak of this Mark 6 helmet, there's some softer curves rather than edges, and as such I like to glaze the highlight out a bit more, as you can see here. This just takes a little bit of patience to build up the highlights with heavily diluted paint, and I'm working up here through the oranges to the Ungor stage. Finally, I just took a tiny amount of Evil Sun's red and glazed this around the outside of the transition to smooth it out. Now it was time to paint the lenses, and for this I first base coated them using Warpstone Glow. This is then highlighted with a mix of Warpstone Glow and Moot Green. This was then followed by pure moot green on the lower edge of the lens. And for the final sharp edge highlight, I added white into the moot green. A tiny amount of Caliban green is then glazed into the top corner of the lens. And finally, a dot of white finishes the look. I then went on to pick out the rivets on the helmet using Vallejo Model Air Silver, and then it was time to paint the rest of the gunmetal. For this, my go-to base coat is Vallejo Metal Color Dark Aluminium. This is the one that comes in the 32ml pot. It's a pre-thinned airbrush paint, so you don't need to add any water. Simply brush on a couple of coats out of the pot and then it's time to add some shading. And for that I used Nuln Oil, but you could really use any black wash or shade paint here. After that I played around with using some Rattling Grime to add some warmer tones to the metal, but you could also use something like Agrax instead. Finally, a sharp edge highlight around all of the edges with silver finishes off the gunmetal nicely, and there's no better silver in my opinion than Vallejo Model Air Silver, but feel free to use whatever bright silver works for you. I went on to paint the other areas of metal on the miniature with the same recipe, including the articulated straps on the front of the Marine, and also the vents on the backpack, neatly finishing all of the rivets on it with pure silver. For the black weapon casing, I'm going to use a very straightforward neutral black recipe. For the chunky edge highlight, I used a mix of Eshin Grey and black. This is then followed by a sharper edge highlight of Dawnstone Grey. And for the final highlight, I used Administratum Grey on the upwards facing edges. And for anyone wondering about the other black areas of the miniature, like the black undersuit, I used exactly this same recipe there too. A few final dots of white on the corners of the casing completes the look. Now once everything was assembled, I decided to add a few bits of scratches and battle damage to the red using the same highlight stages I had used previously. Personally, I like to keep these quite refined and subtle. I find keeping them very fine helps to give some scale to the miniature. For anyone wondering about the base recipe, it was simply painted by base coating with Rhinox hide and then dry brushing various grey tones over the top. I then added small amounts of rusty pigment around the rocks to finish it off. Finally, within some of the scratches, I added some Rhinox hide above the highlight to simulate a deeper damage to the armour, and that completes the miniature. Thank you to everyone who made it this far, and a special thanks to all these wonderful people on screen right now, who without their kind support on Patreon, I wouldn't be able to make content like this. And as a thank you, this month I'll be giving away this miniature to one lucky tier 2 and above subscriber. As I mentioned earlier, I've added a lot of high quality and full length tutorials on the Patreon over the last year, including these ones recently on Dark Angels, Leagues of Votann and the new Cadian Shock Troops. For the cost of £5 a month, you'll have access to all of them, plus a load of other videos, as well as having a say on the future content of the channel and Patreon exclusive area of the community Discord. Catch you in the next video.